My name is Nadia Roswell. I am 38 years old. I have a younger sister named Petra. I have a best friend named Sylvie who has been the only consistent, honest presence in my life for the last 20 years. I have a lawyer named Edmund Hale who I only learned existed 11 days ago. And I have a grandmother named Dorothea Roswell, Grandma Dot, who passed away 4 months ago at the age of 89, and who, it turns out, loved me in ways I never fully understood while she was alive. I'm writing this because I need to. I've been carrying this story in my chest like a fist for nearly 3 months now, ever since the evening I sat in Edmund's office on the second floor of a building that smelled like old paper and lemon wood polish, and he slid a manila envelope across the desk to me and said quietly, "Your grandmother wanted you to have this. She wanted you to know she always knew." I didn't understand what he meant for about 4 seconds, and then I opened the envelope, and then I cried in a stranger's office for the first time in my adult life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back. Let me go all the way back because this story, my story, doesn't make any sense without the beginning, and the beginning is not a happy place. Bear with me. It gets better. It also gets much, much worse before it gets better. That's the thing about real life. It doesn't do you the favor of spacing out its gut punches. Chapter 1: The House on Aldermore Lane. I grew up in a house on Aldermore Lane in a mid-sized city in the American Midwest that I won't name specifically, because I still live here and my sister still lives here, and this story isn't finished yet in the way that real-life stories never quite finish. The house was a 1940s craftsman bungalow with a wide front porch, original hardwood floors that creaked in a specific musical sequence if you walked down the hallway fast enough, a kitchen that smelled permanently of my mother's cardamom tea, and a backyard with an enormous oak tree that my father had hung a rope swing from when Petra and I were small. It was a beautiful house. Not grand, we were not a grand family, but beautiful in the specific way that loved in places become beautiful over decades. Every wall had a story. The kitchen doorframe had height markings penciled in for Petra and me from ages 4 through 16, when my mother finally admitted we were done growing. The basement had a crack in the concrete that my father had filled with red cork when I was 7, and called the Dragon's Mouth, to make me less afraid of it. The bathroom tiles had a chip in the corner, where Petra had thrown a shampoo bottle at me during an argument when we were teenagers, and which no one ever fixed because it was too funny to fix. My parents, Harold and Constance Roswell, were good people in the complicated way that most people are good, genuinely loving in their best moments, deeply flawed in their worst, and utterly unaware of the specific architecture of their own favoritism. I don't think they ever sat down and decided to love Petra more than me. I don't think it was a decision at all. It was a gravity. Petra was born bright and magnetic and easy, the kind of child who made rooms feel larger when she entered them. I was born quieter, more careful. I got good grades but didn't perform them. I had friends but didn't need an audience. I was, my mother once told me with genuine affection and zero self-awareness, the easy one to worry less about. Being the easy one to worry less about, it turns out, is a very specific kind of loneliness. Petra was not a bad person either. I want to be absolutely clear about that because this story could read, if I'm not careful, as though she was a villain, and she wasn't. She was a person who had been told from birth in 1,000 small ways that she was the most important person in every room, and she had simply believed it. You would too, most of us would. We become what we are shaped to become, and Petra had been shaped into someone who genuinely could not conceptualize the possibility that she might not deserve something she'd been promised. She was 34 years old to my 38. She was married to a man named Bo Langford, who was pleasant and handsome in a forgettable way, and who I had never once seen do a load of laundry or cook a meal that wasn't on a grill. They had 2 children, a boy of 7 named Colt and a girl of 5 named Rosie, who were genuinely lovely children that I adored unconditionally and who are, I want to say clearly, entirely innocent of everything that happened. I was not married. I had been close once, a man named Warren whom I dated for 4 years in my late 20s, and who had been kind and funny, and ultimately incompatible with the version of myself I was still becoming. We ended things mutually and remained friendly in the way that people remain friendly when a relationship ends well, and neither person did anything unforgivable. I had dated occasionally since then. Nothing that stuck. I had my work. I'm a landscape architect, which is a profession that suits me deeply. The idea of designing living spaces that will outlast their designers, that will grow and change and become something beyond your original intention. And I had Sylvie, and I had, for the years that I had it, my grandmother's Tuesday afternoon phone calls. Chapter 2. What Grandma knew. Dorothea Roswell was my father's mother. She had come to this country from England as a young woman, married my grandfather Walter Roswell in 1958, raised 3 children, buried her husband in 1991, and spent the next 33 years being, in my entirely biased opinion, the most remarkable woman I have ever known. She was small and sharp-eyed and smelled of lily of the valley, and she had opinions about everything and she shared them freely, and she was almost always right in the way that certain old women become almost always right, which is through the slow accumulation of watching people make mistakes and quietly knotting the patterns. She lived in her own house, 21 Millbrook Drive, the house she and Walter had bought in 1963, until 2 years before she died. Then her mobility got bad enough that she moved into a care facility called Hawthorne Gardens, which was expensive and lovely, and which she'd paid for herself out of savings that I was not aware she had. She had a room there with her own furniture and her own books and photographs, and the quilt she'd made herself in 1977, and she received visitors and was, by all accounts, contentedly herself until the very end. She called me every Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon. This had been happening since I was in college. She called Petra too. I later verified this with Petra herself, but she called Petra on Thursdays, and Petra didn't always pick up, and I don't think their calls ran as long as ours. This is not a criticism of Petra. It's just a fact about the particular frequency on which Grandma and I had always existed together. We fit. I don't know how else to say it. We fit in the way that certain people fit, as though you were built to understand each other before you ever met. She asked about my work. She asked about the projects I was designing. She asked about Sylvie and the occasional men I dated and my apartment and my neighborhood and whether I was eating well. And she listened, actually listened, with a quality of attention that I have only encountered in a handful of people in my life, the kind of listening that makes you want to say true things because you know they'll land safely. I told her things I didn't tell my parents. I told her about the loneliness. I told her that I sometimes felt invisible in my own family. I told her that I loved Petra genuinely and fully and also sometimes couldn't be in the same room as the particular way our parents looked at her, the light that came on in their faces, that I could not produce no matter how hard I tried. And Grandma would listen to all of this, and she would say, "I know, my love, I know, and I want you to remember that being seen by the wrong people doesn't mean you're not worth seeing." I held on to that for years. I still hold it. I probably always will. Chapter 3. When everything started to break. My father had his first heart attack when I was 32. It was a mild one, what the cardiologist cheerfully called a warning shot, and he recovered quickly, but it changed things. Dad had always been the family's physical anchor, the person who fixed things and moved furniture and drove long distances without complaint, and after the heart attack he became suddenly, bewilderingly mortal. My mother, who had never fully processed that she would one day have to do things alone, responded to his mortality by becoming anxious in a way she never quite recovered from. Petra lived 40 minutes away. I lived 12 minutes away. This is important, not because I think proximity alone determines obligation, it doesn't, but because it becomes relevant to the pattern of what happened over the next 6 years. When Dad had his heart attack, I was the one who drove to the hospital. Petra came the next day. When he had his follow-up appointments over the following 6 months, I took him to 3 of the 6. Petra took 1. My mother took the rest. When the cardiologist recommended a cardiac rehab program and my father needed someone to drive him 3 times a week for 12 weeks, I drove him 31 of those 36 times. Petra drove 4. Her husband Beau drove 1 under obvious protest. I'm listing these things not to build a ledger, or maybe I am, a little because this is my story and I'm allowed, but because they're the individual stones that eventually became a path, and the path led somewhere I didn't see coming even though I probably should have. My mother's anxiety in the 2 years after my father's heart attack bloomed into something more serious. She began to have what her doctor described as panic attacks, and then as generalized anxiety disorder, and then, after a longer period of careful assessment, as the early stages of something that occupied a position on a spectrum that the doctor was careful not to label too specifically too soon. Her memory began to slip. Small things first, forgetting where she'd put her keys, missing appointments she'd written down, and then larger things, scarier things, Things that made me drive over on Sunday evenings not because she'd asked me to, but because I needed to see for myself that she was managing. I did not tell Petra the full extent of what I was seeing on those Sunday evening visits. I told myself this was because I didn't want to alarm her unnecessarily. But if I'm honest, and I'm trying to be honest in this telling, fully and uncomfortably honest, the real reason was simpler. I knew that if I told Petra, she would have strong opinions about what should be done, and she would not be the one doing most of it, and I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to manage both my parents' increasing needs and my sister's performed concern. That was probably a mistake, but it's where I was. Chapter 4: The Years of Carrying. My father had his second heart attack when I was 34, and this one was not a warning shot. He was in the ICU for 11 days. He came home diminished in ways that were hard to look at directly, slower, shakier, more frightened than he'd ever allowed himself to be before, afraid of his own body now in a way that broke something in him that never fully healed. He needed, after that, a level of day-to-day support that my mother, with her own deteriorating condition, could not fully provide. The conversation about what to do was one of the most painful of my life, which is saying something, given the competition. Petra and I sat with our parents in their living room on a Saturday in October, the leaves outside doing their beautiful, doomed fall thing, and we talked about what their needs were and what was possible. Petra suggested a home aide, a reasonable suggestion. My parents resisted it. They didn't want a stranger in the house. They were from a generation that experienced outside help as failure rather than resource. We talked about a care facility. My parents resisted that too harder, with an edge of fear that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with love. They had been in that house for 31 years, and they did not want to leave it. And I understood that in my bones, the way you understand things that you've absorbed rather than learned. What they wanted, what my mother actually said quietly, looking at her hands, was for one of us to be closer, to help more, to be there. Petra was 40 minutes away. I was 12 minutes away. Petra had 2 small children. I had at that point a flexible enough work schedule and a life that was spacious enough, if not empty, to absorb more. And so the gentle gravitational pull of circumstances arranged itself, and I began spending 2 evenings a week at my parents' house, and then 3, and then 4, and eventually I was essentially splitting my time between my apartment and their home on Aldermore Lane. Petra came on holidays. She came a few weekends a year. She sent flowers on my mother's birthday and called on Sunday afternoons, and when she called she asked how Mom and Dad were doing, and I told her in a filtered, manageable way, and she said, "You're such a trooper, Nadia. Honestly, I don't know how you do it." And then she would talk about Colts Soccer League or Rosie's new preschool teacher, and I would listen, and after I hung up I would sit very still for a moment before going back to whatever my parents needed next. I was not a saint. I want to be clear about this. I was not doing any of it out of pure selfless grace. I was doing it because I loved my parents genuinely, deeply, even in the complicated way that you love people who have disappointed you. I was doing it because I could not conceptualize the alternative. I was doing it because somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the occasional resentment was something that felt, honestly, like the truest version of myself. Someone who shows up, who stays, who does the necessary unglamorous work without requiring an audience. But I was also tired. Permanently, structurally tired in a way that sleep didn't touch. I was tired in my ability to plan my own future. I was tired in my capacity for the kind of sustained attention that my work required. I was tired of being tired and tired of feeling guilty for minding the tiredness. Grandma knew. Our Tuesday calls became something I lived for. She never minimized what I was doing or told me it was easy or told me I shouldn't sometimes resent it. She said once, "The work of tending to the people who needed to tend to you more, that is a particular kind of grief, isn't it, while they're still alive?" I didn't answer. I just breathed into the phone, and she said, "I see you doing it. I want you to know I see it." I think about that all the time now. I think about how much it mattered to be seen by her, even from a distance, even by one person, even by someone whose seeing could not fix anything about the situation. It mattered anyway. It mattered enough to keep going. Chapter 5: The Promise. It was a Tuesday evening in February, 2.5 years ago, and I was at my parents' house. Dad was having a bad day, his energy came and went in unpredictable tides by then, and I'd cooked dinner and helped him to bed early and was sitting with my mother in the living room, watching a nature documentary she'd seen before but didn't remember seeing, when my phone rang. It was Petra. She'd called to talk to Mom, not to me, which was fine, but then she said something to Mom on the phone that I heard through the thin air of the room. I wasn't eavesdropping, I was just there, and what she said was, "I was thinking, Mom, Beau and I have been talking. The kids are getting bigger. We could really use more space. Have you and Dad thought about what's going to happen with the house?" My mother was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I also heard clearly in her gentle, softening voice. "Of course it'll be yours, sweetheart. We've always said that. We've always wanted it in the family." I sat very still. The documentary played. A herd of something moved across an orange plain. Later, after my mother had gone to bed, I sat in the kitchen and thought about what I'd heard and tried to figure out what I felt about it. I was 36 years old. I had been spending 3 to 5 nights a week in that house for nearly 2 years. I had cancelled professional opportunities. I had restructured my finances around my availability to be present for my parents. I had given up, quietly and without drama, a version of my life that had been building towards something I still wanted. And in a single phone call, during which I was literally sitting 10 feet away, my mother had promised the house to Petra. I didn't say anything that night. I wasn't ready. But a few weeks later, when I was alone with my father during one of his better mornings, I brought it up as gently as I could. I told him what I'd heard. I said I wasn't trying to make it a competition, that I just wanted to understand what they were thinking. My father looked at me for a long moment. He had the expression of a man who has been caught doing something he knew was not quite right but has not yet fully processed the wrongness of it. He said, "We thought you'd be fine, Nadia. You're so capable. You always land on your feet. Petra and Beau have the kids and they need the space, and we just thought you'd understand. We thought you'd be fine, Nadia. You're so capable. You always land on your feet. You're so capable. You always land on your feet." I have spent the last 2 years turning those words over like stones, looking at what lives underneath them. What they mean, I think, is this: we took your reliability as proof that you needed nothing from us. We saw your steadiness and interpreted it as independence. We watched you carry things and concluded you needed no one to help carry. We loved you most easily by asking the most of you, and we rewarded the person who asked the most of us by giving her the thing that you helped us keep. I don't think my father meant it cruelly. I don't think my mother did either. I think they meant it in the way that people mean things when they haven't examined the logic underneath their meaning, reflexively, habitually, from a place of love for Petra that had become so automatic it had stopped requiring justification. But it hurt with a clean, precise surgical hurt, the kind that doesn't bleed right away. I told Grandma Dot about it on our next Tuesday call. I tried to be measured. I tried to present it fairly. By the end of the call I was crying, which I almost never did on those calls, and Grandma Dot was uncharacteristically quiet for a long moment after I'd finished. Then she said, "Nadia, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I need you to keep doing what you're doing. I need you to keep caring for them, and I need you to trust me." "Trust you how?" I said. She said, "Just trust me, can you do that?" I said I could, because I always had, because that was the nature of what existed between us. I had absolutely no idea what she meant. I wouldn't understand for another 2 years and 4 months. Chapter 6: The Hardest Year. The year that followed was the hardest of my life. I say this knowing that "hardest year of my life" is a phrase that flattens an experience that was really 1,000 days of small, accumulating difficulty rather than a single dramatic catastrophe. But there was a particular stretch, roughly 14 months, from when I was 36 to 37, that I think of as the period during which I most seriously considered a different kind of life, a life in which I simply stepped back. Let someone else figure out what my parents needed and who would provide it. I didn't do that. I want to be honest. I thought about it seriously enough to call a therapist and make an appointment, which I cancelled, and then make another appointment, which I kept, and which was one of the better decisions I've made in my adult life. My therapist was a woman named Dr. Farida Osai, brilliant, no-nonsense, impossible to bullshit, who helped me understand, over the course of about 8 months of weekly sessions, that I was not keeping myself in this situation because I was weak or because I had no other options. I was keeping myself in it because I had made a decision, consciously or not, about the kind of person I wanted to be. And that was not a trap. That was a choice. And I was allowed to grieve the cost of the choice, while also honouring the choice itself. That helped, not in a magical, solved way. In the gradual, incremental way that most therapeutic insights help, it gave me language for what was happening, and language is a kind of handrail. You can grip it. It keeps you from sliding. My mother's condition continued to decline. She was formally diagnosed. It took longer than it should have, these things always do with a form of early to moderate dementia. She had good days, many of them, where she was almost entirely herself, sharp and warm and full of opinions about the garden and the neighbours and the state of the world. And she had bad days, increasing in frequency, where she would look at me across the kitchen and there would be a flicker of something uncertain in her face, a reaching and not quite finding, and she would say something like Harold, my father's name, and I would say, no, Mom, it's Nadia, and she would smile and say, of course, sweetheart, and we would continue making dinner together as though nothing had happened, because in her experience in that moment nothing had. My father died in the spring. He had a third heart attack in his sleep, quiet and without drama in the way that suited him. He was 71 years old. I was the one who found him in the morning when I'd come over early to help with breakfast. I stood in the doorway of my parents' bedroom for what felt like a very long time before I did anything else. Then I called 911. Then I called Petra. Then I sat down on the floor of the hallway with my back against the wall, and I held my phone in my hands, and I breathed very slowly and carefully, counting my breaths, the way Dr. Osai had taught me. Petra arrived 3 hours later. She had been crying genuinely, sincerely. She had loved Dad, and we held each other in the front hallway of the house for a long time, and for those minutes the history between us didn't matter, and the house didn't matter, and the promise didn't matter. We were just two daughters who had lost their father. That part was simple. That part was only grief. After the funeral, after the people went home and the casseroles stopped arriving and the flowers wilted, and we settled into the new configuration of a world without Harold Roswell in it, the question became what to do about my mother. She could not live alone. She needed support that would only increase over time. Petra and I had conversations about this that were more civil than I'd feared, and we agreed, it was genuinely a mutual agreement, that my mother would transition to a memory care facility. It took several months to find the right place, to get her on a waiting list, to arrange the finances, to talk to her about it in the gentle, careful way that these conversations required. During those months I was still living most of my time at the house on Aldermore Lane, still managing, still present. My mother, on her good days, thanked me with a directness that she had rarely managed when I was younger, that particular clarity that sometimes comes to people in the later stages of illness, when the social performance of things falls away and what's left is the true thing. You've been so good to us, she said once. You've been so good to us, and I know we haven't always been good to you, and I'm sorry for that. I want you to know I'm sorry. I told her she didn't need to be sorry. I told her she'd been a good mother. Both of those things were simultaneously true and incomplete, and she knew it and I knew it, and we held hands across the kitchen table and didn't need to say anything more. She moved into memory care 8 months after my father died. It was a good facility, not as beautiful as Grandma Dot's Hawthorne Gardens, but warm and staffed by people who were genuinely present with their patients, which mattered more than the aesthetics. My mother adjusted better than I expected. She had a friend there, a woman named Luella, who she played cards with and who became a source of great comfort to her. She was, in the ways that counted, okay. The house on Aldermore Lane sat empty. Chapter 7, the conversation I never should have had to have. 6 weeks after my mother moved into memory care, Petra called me. She was warm and slightly careful in a way that I recognized as the manner she adopted when she was about to say something she was not entirely sure I would receive well. She said she and Beau had been talking. She said they were thinking about the timing of transitioning into the Aldermore Lane house. She said she knew it was soon, she acknowledged this, but the kids were settled in school close to there, and the commute for Beau would be significantly better, and the house was just sitting there, and Mom had always said. I know what Mom said, I told her. There was a pause. Are you okay? She asked in the careful voice. I thought about it for a moment. The honest answer was a complicated one. I said, Petra, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Of course, she said. Do you know what I have given up over the last 4 years to be present for Mom and Dad? Not the big things, the small things, the Tuesday nights, the Saturday mornings, the client meetings I cancelled, the trips I didn't take, the apartment I kept paying rent on while sleeping in the same childhood bedroom I grew up in 3 or 4 nights a week. Do you know any of that? There was a longer pause this time. I know you did a lot, she said finally. You always said you didn't mind. I never said I didn't mind, I told her. I said I was managing, those aren't the same thing. The conversation did not resolve anything. It ended with Petra saying she understood, and me not quite believing she did, and both of us agreeing to talk more later. Later came and went several times without the talk happening. In the way that uncomfortable conversations between people who love each other tend to keep not happening. I didn't bring it up again. I am, by nature and by training, someone who does not push for acknowledgement. This is both a strength and a limitation. I stopped expecting the situation to be recognized as unfair and started trying to figure out what I wanted to do about the house, whether I had any legitimate claim to make, and whether this was the question I kept circling, whether any of it actually mattered. And then Grandma died. Chapter 8, The Phone Call from Edmund Hale. She went peacefully, as the phrase goes, the phrase that is both inadequate and the best we have. She went in her room at Hawthorne Gardens on a Thursday morning in November, with the quilt she'd made in 1977 over her, and the photograph of Walter on her nightstand, and according to the nurse who was with her, she was asleep. Her heart simply decided at 89 that it had done enough work. I grieved her in a way I had not fully anticipated, even though I had been anticipating it for years. The grief was clean and deep and had no complicated edges, which is its own kind of relief, to miss someone simply, without ambivalence, without the tangle of unresolved things. I had no unresolved things with Grandma. I had told her everything. She had told me what she could. We were as finished as any relationship can be before it ends. The funeral was small and lovely. There were people there I'd never met, friends from her years at Hawthorne Gardens, neighbours, a woman from her old church who sang a hymn without accompaniment in a voice that made everyone in the room very still. I sat with my father's siblings, my aunts Marguerite and Bet, and we held each other's hands and let ourselves be sad. Petra came. She was kind and genuine and hugged me afterward and said she loved you so much. I said I knew, I did know. 3 weeks after the funeral, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. I was in the middle of a project review and I let it go to voicemail and listened to the message that evening, alone in my apartment with a glass of red wine and the particular silence of a winter night. The message was from a man who identified himself as Edmund Hale, an attorney, and he said that he was the executor of the estate of Dorothea Roswell, and that he had some matters to discuss with me personally at my earliest convenience, and that I could reach him at the number he left. I called him back the next morning. He was professional and warm in a quiet way, and he said he'd prefer to meet in person if I was available, that there were documents involved that were easier to discuss face to face. We arranged a meeting for the following week. I told Sylvie about the call that evening. Sylvie, who had been my best friend for 21 years, who had seen me through the worst of the caretaking years with a loyalty and a lack of false comfort that I valued more than I had words for, said, "Nadia, your grandmother had a lawyer, a specific lawyer who called you specifically. She left you something." "She might have left something to all of us," I said. "Maybe she just wants me to know about it." "She called you specifically," Sylvie said again, with the firmness she reserves for things she considers settled. I didn't sleep well that week. I couldn't identify what I was feeling. It wasn't hope exactly. It was more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something and not being able to see how far down it goes. Chapter 9, The Safe. Edmund Hale's office was on the second floor of a building downtown that smelled, as I said at the beginning of this story, like old paper and lemon wood polish. He was a man in his late 60s, I estimated, silver-haired, deliberate in his movements, with the particular manner of someone who has spent decades being present for people during the most significant moments of their lives, and has learned to carry that presence lightly. His office had 2 good chairs and a window that looked out over a parking structure, and on his desk was a manila envelope and a slightly larger cardboard box that was taped shut. He offered me coffee. I declined. I sat down. He sat down. He said, "Mrs. Roswell, your grandmother, retained me as her attorney 17 years ago. Over the years, she updated her will several times. The most significant update was made approximately 6 years ago, and is the reason I've asked you here today." He paused, assembling his thoughts. "Your grandmother owned several assets, including savings, some investments and personal property, which will be distributed according to her will among her children and grandchildren. Those distributions are straightforward, and will be handled through the standard probate process. Another pause, a deliberate one, I thought. However, he said, there is a separate matter, one that is not part of the standard estate, a matter that your grandmother specifically asked me to discuss with you personally, privately, and before any other family members are informed. I was very still, my hands were in my lap. Your grandmother, he said, was the original owner of the property at 14 Aldermore Lane. I blinked. My parents' house. Yes, your grandparents purchased the property in 1972 as an investment. When your parents married and began looking for a home, your grandparents allowed them to occupy the property and eventually transferred it, they believed, into your father's name. However, he paused again, and I became aware that this was a man who used pauses the way a sculptor uses negative space, intentionally, structurally. The deed transfer in 1984, when your father's name was intended to be placed on the title, was executed incorrectly. There was a legal error in the paperwork, the wrong name was entered on the deed. Your grandmother's name remained the official title holder. This was not discovered at the time and was, for all practical purposes, forgotten. Your parents believed they owned the house. Your grandmother believed they owned the house. The property taxes were paid in a way that didn't raise flags. It was simply a paperwork error that sat undiscovered for decades. I was struggling to follow the legal mechanics while simultaneously processing something larger that was beginning to take shape in my understanding. Your grandmother discovered this error approximately 8 years ago, Edmund Hale continued, when she was updating her own estate documents and asked me to review all of her property holdings. At that point, we realized that she was still, legally, the titled owner of 14 Aldermore Lane. He folded his hands on the desk. She had options at that point. She could have simply corrected the error and transferred the deed to your father, as had been the original intention. She chose not to do that immediately. Instead, she chose to wait, and to watch. To watch, I repeated. She was aware, he said carefully, of the dynamics in your family. She did not share specifics with me, she was a private woman, but she indicated that she had concerns about how the property might eventually be distributed, and she wanted to ensure that it went to the person she felt was most deserving of it. She updated her will 6 years ago to reflect her decision. He slid the manila envelope across the desk. She left the house to you, Nadia. The deed has your name on it. The transfer was completed legally and properly 6 years ago, in full compliance with all applicable property laws. The house at 14 Aldermore Lane belongs to you. I didn't say anything. I looked at the envelope on the desk between us. Through the window behind him, I could see the grey winter sky above the parking structure. Somewhere in my chest, something that had been clenched for years was trying to decide whether it was safe to let go. I opened the envelope. Inside was the deed, a legal document, dry and formal and printed in a standard font with my name on it, Nadia Ann Roswell, clear as anything, real as anything. And underneath the deed was a letter, handwritten in Grandma Dot's careful, looping cursive on 3 pages of her personal stationery, cream-coloured, with a small lily of the valley printed in the corner. I'll share part of it here. I've thought hard about whether to share it at all, and I've decided that she wrote it to be understood, and understanding requires sharing, and I think she would have wanted people to know what she knew. She wrote, "My darling Nadia, I want to begin by telling you that I have known, for a very long time, exactly what you have been doing and what it has cost you. I have watched you love your parents through everything, not because you were obligated to, not because you were asked to, but because that is the kind of person you are, the kind who shows up quietly and without performance and who keeps showing up even when no one is watching. I have watched you show up. I have always been watching. I know what was promised. I know what was not promised to you, and I know what you were given instead of a promise, which was the assumption that you did not need one. I am angry about that on your behalf. I have been angry about it for years. Your parents love you. I believe this absolutely. But love without attention is a feeling that disappears inside itself. They felt it and did not know how to make you feel it, and the cost of that gap was paid by you in ways they do not fully understand. I am telling you this not to make you angry at them. You have too generous a heart for the anger to last long anyway, but because I need you to know that someone has always seen the gap, and known its size, and held the accounting of it carefully. The house belongs to you. It has belonged to you legally since I signed the document 6 years ago. I chose not to tell you because I needed you to keep being exactly who you are, not because you expected a reward, but because it is who you are. I could not have you shape your behavior around the knowledge of what was coming. I needed the gift to find you honestly. I hope you will understand that. I hope you will understand that this is not a payment. Kindness cannot be paid for. This is simply my way of saying, with the most concrete thing I had available to me, I saw you, I always saw you, and you are worth seeing. The house has good bones and a good soul, and it needs someone who loves it to belong to it. I can think of no one better. I love you beyond what language can hold. Take care of the oak tree, your grandma. Chapter 10: The Crying. I cried in Edmund Hale's office for about 10 minutes. He handed me a box of tissues and sat quietly and did not try to say anything to make it stop, which was exactly right. When I was done, he gave me a glass of water and waited while I collected myself. Then he explained the practical situation. The deed was valid and legally sound. There was technically nothing for anyone to contest. My grandmother had owned the property. She had transferred it to me legally. The fact that my parents had lived in the house and believed they owned it was a genuine hardship, but legally, the house had never been theirs in the way they believed. Edmund had already consulted with 2 other attorneys to ensure the legality was airtight, and it was. He also told me gently that how I chose to handle this information was entirely up to me. I did not have to act immediately. I did not have to tell anyone. I could take the time I needed. He recommended I engage my own attorney to review everything independently, which I did, a woman named Isabel Fong, and she confirmed everything Edmund had told me. I drove home in a state that I can only describe as deeply altered, not euphoric, not vindicated, not angry, though anger was somewhere in the mix. I felt like someone who has been carrying a very heavy bag for so long that they've built their whole posture around its weight, and someone has just lifted it, and now I didn't know how to stand. I called Sylvie from my car, parked outside my apartment building in the dark. "Sylvie," I said, "she left me the house." Silence for 3 seconds, then, "Of course she did." Not "Oh my God," not "Are you serious?" Just, "Of course she did," as though this had always been the only possible ending, as though Sylvie too had always been watching and had always known what I was worth and had never needed to be told. I started crying again. Sylvie talked to me from across town for an hour, and at the end of it I was tired and emptied out in the way that only the kind of crying you've been saving for years can empty you, and I went upstairs and I lay in my bed, and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about my grandmother and her lily of the valley stationery, and the oak tree in the backyard, and I fell asleep. Chapter 11: Telling Petra. This part was the hardest. Not legally, not practically, but humanly, because this was my sister, because I love my sister, because I genuinely know, in the way that you know things about people you have known your whole life, that she had believed in the promise of that house completely, and had arranged part of her future around it, and what I was about to tell her was going to dismantle something she'd considered settled. I thought carefully about how to do it. I talked to Dr. Osei about it. I talked to Sylvie. I talked to Isabel Fong about the legal parameters. I decided that I would tell Petra in person alone without Beau present, not because I was hiding anything from him, but because I felt the conversation needed to be between sisters first, before it became anything else. We met at a coffee shop near her house on a Saturday afternoon. The kids were with Beau. She arrived looking healthy and put together and slightly wary. She'd picked up, I think, that this was not a casual catch-up from the way I'd phrased the request. She ordered a latte. I ordered a tea I didn't drink. I told her everything, all of it. The attorney's call, Edmund Hale's office, the deed, the letter. I told her about the paperwork error from 1984. I told her that our grandmother had owned the house legally for our entire lives. I told her what the letter said, or as much of it as I could get through without losing my composure, which was not all of it. Petra's face went through several distinct expressions during this. Confusion first, then a particular still processing expression she'd had since childhood, then something that I think was grief, not dramatic grief, but the quiet, sinking recognition of a thing being permanently rearranged. Then, to her genuine credit, what I can only describe as a long, slow breath that she let out all the way to its end. She was quiet for almost a minute after I finished, then she said, "How long have you known?" 11 days, I said. Another silence. She looked down at her latte, then she said, "Did Grandma know about what Mom and Dad promised me?" "I think she did," I said. "I think that's part of why she did it." Petra nodded slowly. She was not crying. I wasn't either. We were two adult women sitting in a coffee shop in the winter, rearranging the map of something we'd both believed was settled. Then she said something that I did not expect. She said, "I think I knew it wasn't fair." I waited. "I knew," she said. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't know what you were doing those years or that I couldn't have done more of it. I knew I wasn't doing enough. I told myself it was because of the kids and the commute and 100 other things that were partly true, but they were also partly just convenient. And I knew you were there and you were managing, and I let myself not look at it too directly because it was easier not to." She met my eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm really sorry, Nadia." "I think I knew it wasn't fair." She met my eyes. "I'm really sorry, Nadia." I sat with that for a moment. This was a different kind of moment than I had been bracing for. I had prepared in some internal way for anger, for denial, for Petra to tell me I was being unfair, or that this was our grandmother playing favourites, or that the promise from our parents had a moral weight that should be honoured regardless of what the deed said. I had not prepared for this, for the apology, for its directness. I said, "Thank you for saying that." She said, "I mean it." I said, "I know you do." We sat with it for a while. The coffee shop hummed around us. Someone's child somewhere nearby was asking for a muffin with a great deal of commitment. And then I told her what I'd been thinking about for the past 11 days. I told her what I wanted to do. Chapter 12, What I Wanted to Do. I want to be honest about this part, because there is a version of this story in which I am purely magnanimous and generous, and the ending is clean, and that is not quite the truth. The truth is messier and more human than that. My first instinct in the days immediately after Edmund Hale's office was not generous at all. My first instinct was something hot and compressed that wanted to say, "The house is mine, legally, unambiguously mine. The promise your parents made to Petra was made without the authority to make it. I owe nobody anything here." That instinct was real. I'm not ashamed of it. It had been building for 4 years and it was allowed to exist. But here's the thing about sitting with hot feelings long enough. They cool, and what remains underneath the cooling is usually the truest thing you feel. And the truest thing I felt when the heat passed was this: I did not want to burn everything down. I did not want to use this as a weapon. I did not want to look at my sister's children, Colt and Rosie, who had done nothing, who were 7 and 5 and innocent of every adult failure around them, and know that I had taken something from them out of a long-harboured need to be right. I also did not want to give the house to Petra. Let me be clear, I was not going to do that. The house belonged to me and I was going to keep it. That was settled in my mind and heart and my grandmother's handwriting, and no amount of generosity of spirit was going to change it. But what I could do, what I had been thinking about for 11 days, was the manner in which I kept it, the manner in which this transition happened, the question of whether the fact of my legal right needed to become a weapon, or whether it could simply become a fact. I told Petra, "I'm going to move into the house, I want to live there. I've wanted to live there for years if I'm being honest with myself. It has my grandmother's bones in it and my parents' memories and my childhood and I love it. I'm going to move in." She nodded. "But I want to talk to you about the kids, Colt and Rosie. I know that Oak Tree meant something to you all. I know you'd built something in your minds about that house and those kids growing up there. And I want you to know the house being mine doesn't mean you lose the house. It doesn't mean the kids lose the yard or the rope swing or their aunt's home. It means I'm the one who lives there, and my door is open. That doesn't change." Petra looked at me for a long time, then she said, "You're a better person than I am." "I don't think so," I told her honestly. "I think I've just had more practice being clear about what I actually want." Chapter 13, Beau. Petra's husband Beau did not take the news well. This surprised exactly no one who knew Beau, including Petra. He called me 2 days after Petra, and I had our coffee shop conversation. He was not rude exactly. He knew better than to be rude to me directly, but he was pressing and slightly aggressive in the particular way of men who have been told they cannot have something they expected, which is to challenge the legitimacy of the thing that stands between them and what they want. He said things like, "Your parents made a commitment," and "Legally, sure, but morally this is a different question," and "I just think a family conversation would be appropriate before you make any decisions." I let him finish, then I said, "Beau, the legal matter is settled. I've had it reviewed by 2 attorneys. I'm not asking for permission or consensus about my own property. I'm telling you as a courtesy what's going to happen. The house belongs to me, I'm going to move in. Petra and I have spoken and we're okay. I'd like for you and I to be okay too because you're my brother-in-law and you're my niece and nephew's father, but my right to my own home is not negotiable. He was quiet for a moment. Then, this is really hard on Petra. I imagine it is, I said. Harder things have happened in this family. Petra is going to be okay. He hung up without saying goodbye, which was fine. I understand men like Beau in the way you understand weather patterns, not personally, just predictably. He would adjust. He didn't have a choice and eventually he would figure that out. He did in fact adjust. It took about 6 weeks, during which there was a period of pointed distance from that side of the family that I chose not to react to. And then Colt had a school event and asked specifically if Aunt Nadia could come, and Beau, to his credit, said yes, and I went, and afterward Beau and I had an awkward 20 minutes in the parking lot that functioned as an olive branch, extended and accepted without either of us needing to say anything explicit about it. Someday we'll be fine, we're already getting there. Chapter 14, The Move. I moved into the house on Aldermore Lane on the first Saturday in March. It was a cold, bright day, the kind of early spring day that is technically winter but smells like something is getting ready to happen. Sylvie helped me move. She had borrowed a truck from a friend and driven it over at 8 in the morning, and she showed up with 2 large coffees and the specific energy of someone who is genuinely, unperformatively happy for you. We carried boxes through the front door of the house where I had grown up, and each trip back and forth across the threshold was its own small ceremony that neither of us named. I brought things that were mine and things that were new, a bed I'd bought, a desk lamp I loved, books and plants, and the particular organized chaos of a life moved from one place to another. I filled the rooms gradually with my own objects until the house began to smell differently, to settle into a new shape that was still the old shape, still the bones of the place I'd always known, but inhabited now by the right person. At some point in the late afternoon, Sylvie and I sat on the front porch with the coffees we hadn't finished from the morning, cold by then, and looked at the yard. The oak tree stood at the far end of the backyard, still bare but patient. The rope swing my father had hung, weathered and slightly frayed, turned very slowly in the wind like a clock's second hand, measuring its own kind of time. Your grandmother was something else, Sylvie said. She was, I agreed. She watched the whole thing all those years, and she just waited, trusted you. Trusted me to keep being me, I said, which is a terrifying thing to trust honestly. What if I'd changed? Sylvie smiled. She knew you wouldn't. I thought about that, the quality of faith that required, the depth of knowledge of a person that would make you confident enough to stake a house on them, to wait years watching carefully, holding the most concrete gift you had, and believing that the moment would come and the person would be unchanged and deserving still. I thought about what it means to be known, not perfectly, not completely, but known in the specific way that my grandmother knew me through years of Tuesdays, through all the things I'd been willing to say on those calls, through the attention she'd given to who I was rather than who I performed being. To be known like that at least by one person across a lifetime, I think that's enough. I think that might be the whole thing actually. I think if you can be known like that by even one person before you die, you have not been invisible in this world, no matter how invisible you felt. Chapter 15, The Morning After the First Night. The first night I slept in the house on Aldermore Lane as its owner, its legal, rightful, fully understood owner, I woke up at 4 in the morning the way you do in a new place, that brief confusion of space before you remember where you are. And then I remembered, and I lay there in the dark and listened to the specific sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards adjusting to temperature, the particular quality of quiet that old houses have, the branch of something outside tapping lightly against the window in the wind. I thought about my father measuring our heights on the kitchen doorframe. I thought about my mother, her cardamom tea and her better days and her graceful, gentle adjustment to her smaller life. I thought about Grandma Dot, sitting in her room at Hawthorne Gardens with the photograph of Walter and the quilt she'd made herself, knowing all of it, holding all of it, choosing deliberately to act. I thought about kindness, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that performs its own goodness, but the quiet kind, the kind that consists of simply doing what is needed, of being present without requiring credit for presence, of showing up Tuesday after Tuesday and year after year and trusting that somewhere in the architecture of it, a record is being kept, not by God or fate or the universe, which are abstractions and cold comfort, by people. By specific, real, watching people who love you enough to pay attention. My grandmother kept the record. She held the accounting. She waited until the right moment, and then she gave me the most concrete thing she had, which was a house with good bones and an oak tree, and the handwriting of a woman who knew me on 3 pages of Lily of the Valley stationery. I fell back asleep at around 5, with the first suggestion of grey light at the edges of the curtains. I slept deeply and dreamlessly, the sleep of someone who has come home after a very long journey, who has set down something heavy, who is, finally, where they are supposed to be. Chapter 16, Where Things Stand Now. It has been 3 months since I moved in. I want to tell you where things stand now, honestly, without tidying it up into something cleaner than the truth. The house is mine, and it is becoming mine in the slow daily way that houses become yours, through the meals cooked in the kitchen, the particular arrangement of objects on shelves, the way you learn which floorboards creak and how to avoid them or choose not to avoid them, depending on your mood. I have repaired several things that needed repair. I have not changed the height markings on the kitchen doorframe. I have bought a new rope for the swing in the backyard. Colt and Rosie came over last month and used it for 2 hours, and I sat in a lawn chair and watched them and drank coffee and thought about how, sometimes, the way a thing gets passed down does not match the plan, but the thing itself, the yard, the tree, the rope, the afternoon, still happens, still lands where it was supposed to land. My mother is doing as well as she can be doing, which varies by week but includes on good weeks card games with Lowella and visits from me and Petra and the children, and on bad weeks, a gentler fog that the staff at the facility navigate with real skill. I see her twice a week. Petra sees her once. This is more equitable than it used to be. Things shift. People shift when they are forced to. I have found, surprisingly, more compassion for Petra in the wake of all of this than I expected, something about the apology, the directness of it, the acknowledgement that she had known and looked away. It's harder to resent someone who can see themselves clearly. It makes space for something else. Beau is cordial. We will never be close, but we are managing. He brought a bottle of wine when they came over for dinner last month and made a point of saying the backyard looked good, which is Beau, for I am choosing to get along with you. I accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered. Dr. Osai asked me in a session a few weeks ago how I felt about all of it now, not the logistics but the feeling, the whole arc of it. I thought about it for a while, then I said, I think the story turned out to be about something different than what I thought it was about while it was happening. She waited. I thought it was a story about fairness, about whether the sacrifice would be recognized, whether I'd get anything back, and I got the house so you could say it was, but that's not actually, I don't think that's the story. I think the story is about being seen. I think my grandmother saw me in a way my parents couldn't quite manage, and she held that seeing carefully for years and eventually turned it into something I could hold in my hands, and I think that's the part that healed something. Not the house, the being seen. Dr. Osai said in her particular way, and do you feel seen now, by yourself? I thought about that for a moment, a real moment, not a polite one. More than I used to, I said, getting there. Epilogue: The Oak Tree. This is the last thing I want to say, and it's about the oak tree. Last week I was in the backyard in the early evening, when the light goes that particular amber colour that April does in the Midwest, and I was looking at the oak tree, which is enormous. It must be 80 or 90 years old, older than the house's rope swing and older than my grandmother's purchase of it, and older than all of us. And I was thinking about how my father called it the dragon's mouth in the basement, about how my grandmother signed off on a letter with "Take care of the oak tree." About how Colt and Rosie swung from it last month, shrieking with the specific delight of children who have been given height and speed. Trees like that, old, rooted, enormous, they don't care about deeds. They don't care about property law or family dynamics or who was promised what. They just grow. They put down roots in the one place they are and they grow, year after year, adding rings that no one will count until they're gone. They become enormous through the simple accumulation of being present. Through showing up, winter and summer and winter again, through the full range of what weather can do to a living thing. I stood at the base of it and put my hand on the bark, which was rough and warm from the last of the day's sun, and I thought, Grandma Dot, I'm taking care of it, I promise. And then I went inside and made dinner, and called Sylvie and watched something terrible on television, and fell asleep on the couch in the living room of the house that my grandmother left me, which is the house where I grew up, which is the house that is mine, which is full of creek music and height markings, and the ghost of cardamom tea, and the memory of my father's voice saying dragon's mouth to make me less afraid, and which has in its backyard an oak tree that has been standing longer than any of us, and will be standing still when all of this, the drama, the deed, the letters, the years of carrying, is as distant and unspecified as the paperwork error that started it all in 1984. The house has good bones. My grandmother was right about that. So it turns out do I. TLDR. I'm 38F. For 4 years I was the primary caregiver for my parents through serious illness, heart attacks, dementia, end of life. During this time my parents promised the family home to my sister, who lives further away and contributed far less. When my grandmother died, I found out through her attorney that she had legally owned the house my entire life due to a 1984 paperwork error, and that she had discovered this 8 years ago, transferred the deed into my name 6 years ago, and left me a handwritten letter explaining why. The house is legally mine. My sister and I have had a genuine conversation. I've moved in. The oak tree is doing well. Memo edit, for everyone asking about my grandmother's letter, I've shared the portions of it that I felt were meant to be shared. There are parts of it that are private, things she said to me about her own life and her own regrets and her own love, that I'm keeping. I hope that's understood. She was a private woman and some of what she gave me was meant only for me. For the people saying my grandmother was manipulative for not telling me sooner, I thought about this too. Hard. My conclusion is that she was strategic in the most loving possible way. She knew that if I'd known it would have changed how I acted, and she didn't want my care and presence to be transactional. She wanted it to be what it was, free, chosen, mine. I think she was right. I think I would have been subtly different if I'd known. I'm glad I wasn't. For the people asking about my parents, they didn't know. None of this was their choice or their design. They believed they owned the house and made decisions accordingly. They were wrong in some of those decisions, and some of those wrongs cost me things I'd have liked to keep. But they were not malicious. People very rarely are. Green heart final edit, one more thing. I planted something under the oak tree last weekend, a lily of the valley. It won't bloom until next spring, maybe the one after. They take their time, but it'll be there, growing. For anyone out there who is currently in the carrying years, doing the quiet work that no one is applauding, showing up for people who don't always show up for you, wondering whether any of it registers. Somewhere, someone is watching. Sometimes it takes longer than you think for the acknowledgement to arrive, and sometimes it arrives in a form you couldn't have predicted, and sometimes it doesn't arrive at all, and that is the most honest thing I can tell you, because I am not promising the world works fairly. But I am telling you, being the person who shows up is its own kind of answer, to who you are, to who you choose to be. That part is yours regardless of what the deed says. Take care of your oak trees.